I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm talking again about Ukraine and bringing a perspective that you won't hear in the mainstream media. I've found that my best sources on Ukraine have been on Substack, from Glenn Greenwald to Aaron Mate, Matt Taibbi, Caitlin Johnstone, and in particular today, I'm going to be looking at Robert Malone. Robert Malone made his name really talking about COVID and all the different things that we weren't hearing about. And I think that's a really hopeful thing because what he's shown is that that information gets transferred. That once you find out that the Department of Health is dealing in corruption and is misleading us, that you can transfer that information to the Department of Defense, even when you come from a military background, as his family does. So when we're hearing a lot about the agitations for war, what we're not hearing about is the movement towards peace. So we'll be looking at that, and then we'll be going to the economic blowback, looking with Michael Hudson at that. We hear sometimes about the possibility of nuclear war, and that's been a big deal, of course, but not so much what the economic sanctions may end up doing in terms of their repercussions on the US and the EU. So we'll be delving deeper into that, looking at it from Michael Hudson's perspective and also from the perspective of my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, and what I talk about in terms of the Petropocalypse, the petrodollar, and its impact on geoeconomics. I think that Substack is the most neutral platform out there because it's direct from the producer to the consumer. And so I've started putting my videos there, starting with Escape from Azkaban, Victoria Nuland, and Ukraine. If you haven't seen that, I'm going to link to it at the end of this one because my Ukrainian videos are building on each other. And I think that one was my most ambitious because it takes a lot of the history of this conflict and tries to put it into a coherent form. I also like Substack because I can add things to it in terms of text. So something that I posted on that episode is a quote from Matt Taibbi, where he talks about the overgrown risk-playing lunatics in the neocon treehouse. People like Paul Wolfowitz, Elliot Abrams, Richard Pearl, Bill Kristol, Max Boot, David Frum, and Robert Kagan, husband to Joe Biden's current Undersecretary of Global Dominance, Victoria Nuland. So I also put in there some clarifications of what I thought was being misunderstood from my perspective. And so saying that the U.S. is responsible for the horrors in Ukraine is not the same as saying that Ukrainians are responsible for the horrors or that what's happening isn't horrible. In particular, I'm saying Victoria Nuland and Joe Biden are responsible for the horrors in Ukraine, and Victoria Nuland and Hillary Clinton are responsible for the horrors in Syria and Libya, and that Victoria Nuland and Dick Cheney are responsible for the horrors in Iraq and Afghanistan, along with Victoria's husband, Robert Kagan, co-founder of Project for the New American Century. I also added that every country has neo-Nazis and Islamic jihadists and pure-blood supremacists. That's not a problem, and that's not anything to blame the country for. The blame is, and the problem is, when a foreign country comes in and arms them and funds them. That's what has happened in Ukraine. And if that were to happen in the U.S., we would certainly see that as a problem, especially if the intent was to overthrow the government and they were successful. Enough said. I've mentioned before what Caitlin Johnstone and Matt Taibbi got wrong, because both of them said the media keeps saying Putin is going to invade Ukraine. He's not. But let's look at the larger issue of what they got right, which is why the media kept saying that. The media couldn't wait to start building this hysteria of warmongering. Because I'm talking to a very savvy audience, I can say it reminds me of that reporter who was standing in front of Building 5 on 9/11 saying, and the building has collapsed when you can see it in the background, until a firefighter shuffles her away and says, you have to get out of here. It's about to blow. The question isn't, was she wrong? The question is, why did she already know when it hadn't happened? Another thing that Matt Taibbi has gotten right is his article on "We thought that Putin would be our bastard, but it turns out he's his own bastard." There's another article that's come out by Greg Palast, who is the author of The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. And his article is "Putin is Russia's Pinochet." He gives a fascinating history of how the decision to promote Putin was made in Davos, Switzerland, that the Russian oligarchs who were there saw that Yeltsin was not going to be able to win against his opponent, and that his opponent was likely to seize their assets. And so they made the Davos Pact, which was to promote Yeltsin at all costs, and all costs meant buying up all the media and making sure that he got in, and that his running mate was the person they chose based on the model of Pinochet, and that was Putin. Towards the end of getting Yeltsin and Putin elected, Bill Clinton jumped into the fray and supplied an army of election and PR consultants. But it turned out that Putin was not the Russian oligarchs' bastard either, because he has taxed them and caused a lot of flight of that capital, particularly to banks, EU banks in Greece and Cyprus, which was part of tanking their economies. A curious fact on Robert Malone's Substack is that the top nationality of donors to the Clinton Foundation were Ukrainian with 10 million. So maybe that's where some of that Russian oligarch money went. Greg Palast concludes this article by saying that those who say NATO expansionism has triggered this are just spouting nonsense, because NATO inclusion of Ukraine was never on the table. Well, as Caitlin Johnstone says, why didn't they just guarantee that? Why did they lead Ukraine to believe that that was a possibility? And his last line is, I stand with democracy, I stand with Ukraine, which sounds like a very strange thing for the author of The Best Democracy That Money Can Buy. Making Caitlin's point that the purpose of the U.S. media is warmongering, she has a clip from The Intercept of reporters who are badgering the White House spokesperson on why aren't we being more aggressive? Why aren't we giving Ukraine weapons? What will it take for us to take this seriously and go to their defense? The only exception is Ryan Grimm from The Hill, who says, are there movement towards diplomacy? Is there a peace deal that we're trying to facilitate? And it's an interesting thing that one question is whether Ukraine will have the power to remove the economic sanctions from Russia, and there is no answer that's given to that. But progress towards peace is something that Robert Malone talks about when he quotes from the Epoch Times and an author named Tom Ozimek. He's looking at what Russia is asking for. What is the onerous terms that Russia's spokesperson for the Kremlin is trying to impose on Ukraine in order to give peace? What they're saying is that they must become like Austria or Sweden. What does that mean? That means they would be a demilitarized zone, a neutral space that would still have its own army and its own navy for defense, but that would not allow foreign bases, would not allow, presumably, weapons of mass destruction that are being manufactured there, would not be part of any military alliance. And that is the deal that is on the table. And what was Ukraine's answer? Ukraine has admitted that NATO membership and NATO involvement are off the table. But what they've said, and demanded, in order for Russia to agree to go back home, is that they want them to say that next time they will have the security assurance that the West can create a no-fly zone, that they will come in with military intervention so that they can make sure that they're protected. Now, this seems to me like someone who is pinned down in a fight who's saying, in order for me to allow you to get off my back, first I want to know that my brother can come in with a gun next time and shoot you. Of course, he's not going to give you back half of your gold, which is what he's stolen at this point, and I don't have the ability to promise that, but still, that's what I demand in order for you to get off of me. Ukraine says they're looking for real guarantees, not like the ones in the Budapest Memorandum. I talk about the Budapest Memorandum in my Victoria Nuland episode. In that, Russia and the EU and the United States all agreed that they would militarily intervene if there was a threat to Ukrainian sovereignty. And that included an economic threat. And so that's actually what Russia has done, because Ukraine can't be seen as just one. Ukraine are the Eurocranians, as I call them, and the Russian Ukrainians. So what Russia has done is fulfill its obligations under the Budapest Memorandum. But now what Ukraine is asking for from Russia is that the US and the EU and NATO promise that they will intervene. And that seems kind of nonsensical to me. Now let's go to the economics of this in an article in The Cradle by Pepe Escobar called Say Hello to Russian Gold and Chinese Petroyuan. I write about the Petropocalypse, as I call it, in my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. And what I say is that products like oil and gas are really chump change. The real big game hunters are going after the currencies, money without any bother of actual production. And so the petrodollar is really where you need to be watching if you want to understand global politics. Now, Michael Hudson has his fingers on the pulse of this more than anyone else. What he says is that the confiscation of half of Russia's gold, which is what is rumored to have happened, is something that is driving Russia and China together, and that they've made a pact that they're forming the Eurasia Economic Union. And they're also looking at a version of The Hague. They're looking at a different oil bourse and different trading in currencies other than the petrodollar. Hudson says that the Western countries are still acting as if they control the market, but that the crucial fact is that NATO countries only make up 15% of the world's population. And I would add, that's 15% of pure consumers. All the producer nations are outside, the other 85%, who would love to get out from under the thumb of the U.S. We have already confiscated Venezuela's gold, Libya's gold, Afghanistan's gold. And so now with Russia, with even things like Canada and the confiscation of bank accounts, it is no longer seen as a trustworthy arbiter of money. According to Hudson, Washington's plan is to use Ukraine as a disposable pawn in order to go scorched earth on Russia and then pivot to China. Now, this is not exactly a surprise to them, and under those conditions, it's better to break sooner rather than later. So Iran has demonstrated the way to do this. Even with sanctions, they are reported to be selling 3 million barrels a day of their oil. Saudi Arabia has just signed a deal with China to accept the yuan in exchange for oil. And so this seems to be catapulting our emergence into a world of actual trade. and we're not very well set up for that as a pure consumer country. What's a person to do with this kind of information? You can be a prepper and get a gun to guard your chickens, or what I do is take a socio-spiritual view and say, I think there's something here at work in our favor. Right now, what money has is a bribe. What you get in exchange for an hour of your labor is 10 hours of someone in a migrant field or 100 hours of someone in a sweatshop in China. If we didn't have that kind of bribe, we would stop working for the oligarchs. We would figure it out. We would get into regenerative agriculture. We would start exchanging services and have our own monetary system, which is what I talk about in my book. Unless you're someone who believes that we in the empire should never have to do manual labor because that's what our global servants are for, my recommendation is that you just enjoy the ride and watch what's going on, because there's nothing you can do about it anyway. But just have faith that it is leading you into a place where we can get off the raft and start planting. If you want more, I really recommend this one about Victoria Nuland. It hasn't gotten as many views as it should, but it is my most ambitious in terms of putting the pieces together on this story. And then here's an entire playlist that talks more about the global economics. Thank you, and I hope you subscribe.